The first almost imperceptible yet deeply ominous intrusion of water was what shattered Sergeant Bill Sarge Peterson's fragile sense of evening peace. It wasn't the percussive symphony of the burgeoning spring storm, a meteorological drama already raging with theatrical fury outside his small, meticulously adapted home in the Willow Creek Estates. That was a sound he'd grown accustomed to over his 5 years here, a tempestuous lullaby he sometimes even found strangely soothing. No, this was something far more insidious. It was a creeping, bone-chilling dampness, seeping with unnatural stealth into the fibers of the worn but cherished oriental rug beneath his heavy-duty wheelchair, a subtle, ominous darkening of the weave at the base of the interior wall, nearest his custom-built roll-in shower. His brow deeply furrowed with the lines of past battles and present concerns tightened further. He'd weathered far more ferocious downpours in this very house, deluges that had turned the streets outside into temporary rivers, and never before had so much as a single errant trickle dared to breach its well-sealed defenses. Now, as his practiced gaze swept the perimeter of his living room, his sanctuary, he saw another dark, spreading stain blossoming with alarming speed near the reinforced threshold of his wide patio door, a seal that had always been an impenetrable bulwark against the elements. A sudden prickle of profound unease, as sharp and cold as shrapnel, traced an unwelcome path up his spine. This wasn't right. This was fundamentally, terrifyingly not normal. Propelling his chair with powerful, urgent strokes towards the panoramic window, he peered out into the wind-lashed, rain-swept chaos of the night. He saw not just the near-horizontal sheets of torrential rain illuminated by the flickering streetlights, but a churning miniature lake, forming with terrifying, almost preternatural speed in his small, carefully tended therapeutic garden, the dark water already greedily lipping at the lower edge of his vital accessibility ramp. And then a flicker of movement from next door, lights snapping on erratically in Corporal Maria Sanchez's similarly adapted home. And through a momentary deceptive lull in the wind's howl, he thought he heard a faint, distinctly panicked shout, a human sound nearly swallowed by the storm's roar. The gnawing unease instantly solidified into a sickening, visceral dread. Something was terribly catastrophically wrong, an unseen malice working its will under the convenient, tumultuous cover of the raging storm. Dr. Elena Ramirez, the State Director for Water Resources and Environmental Management, felt the familiar persistent knot of tension in her shoulders begin to ease just slightly as she finally navigated her sturdy SUV into her father's familiar driveway in Willow Creek Estates. The long drive from the state capitol had been increasingly treacherous, the radio a grim companion, issuing ever more urgent flash flood warnings for several low-lying counties, including this one, nestled precariously near the confluence of two rapidly swelling rivers. Her father, retired Army Master Sergeant Antonio Ramirez, a man whose quiet resilience seemed as deeply rooted and unshakable as the ancient oak trees that lined these deceptively tranquil suburban streets, had sounded more strained, more overtly worried than usual on their last brief phone call. It wasn't for his own well-being. Antonio Ramirez rarely, if ever, complained about his own discomforts. But for his neighbors, his comrades, a small, tight-knit group of fellow veterans, residing in the specially adapted cluster of homes at the quiet, slightly lower-lying end of Sycamore Lane. "Something's not right down here, Elena Mija." He'd stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that nonetheless conveyed deep unease. This new HOA president, this Brenda Van Owen woman, she's been a real thorn, making serious trouble for Sarge and Maria, constantly fussing about their ramps, their little therapeutic gardens, anything that doesn't fit her perfect picture. Now, this big storm coming, I just have a very bad feeling deep in my gut. Elena, whose entire professional life was dedicated to understanding the intricate dance of water, its life-giving power, its often underestimated destructive potential, and the myriad, frequently deliberate ways human actions could pervert its natural pathways, turning it from a vital resource into an instrument of devastation, found her own internal alarms beginning to resonate with his foreboding. She was officially here for a rare weekend visit, a much-needed respite from endless budget meetings, contentious legislative hearings, and bureaucratic wrangling. But her highly attuned professional senses, the instincts of a seasoned hydrologist, were already tingling, a silent premonition of trouble brewing beneath the surface of Willow Creek's placid facade. Willow Creek Estates, on casual inspection, presented an image of idyllic suburban perfection. Meticulously manicured emerald lawns, stately brick-fronted homes, exuding an air of quiet affluence, a carefully cultivated veneer of prosperous tranquility. But beneath that polished, expensive surface, deep-seated tensions had been simmering, then actively boiling, particularly for the small, distinct enclave of disabled veterans. Their homes thoughtfully and necessarily modified for accessibility, with features like wide, gently sloping ramps, zero-threshold doorways, specially adapted bathrooms, and small functional therapeutic gardens, had recently become the unwelcome, obsessive focus of the Homeowners Association's newly, and some said, contentiously elected president, Mrs. Brenda Van Owen. A woman whose perfectly lacquered, almond-shaped nails and impeccably tailored, sharply creased pantsuits seemed to be an outward manifestation of her rigid, unyielding worldview. Brenda Van Owen championed an almost fanatical militant adherence to what she termed aesthetic uniformity and the sacrosanct preservation of optimal property values. She appeared to view any deviation from her narrowly defined, almost sterile vision of suburban perfection, a vision that seemingly had no tolerance or space for the visible, tangible realities of disability or individual adaptation, as a personal affront, a discordant note in her meticulously orchestrated symphony, a blight to be aggressively, ruthlessly eradicated. Sarge Peterson, who had sacrificed both his legs to a treacherously concealed IED in the dust of Kandahar, relied implicitly on his sturdy ramps for basic mobility, and found a measure of solace and purpose in the rich, dark soil of his slightly raised vegetable beds, a connection to the earth that grounded him. Maria Sanchez, who battled the invisible but no less debilitating demons of severe PTSD and chronic anxiety after multiple harrowing tours as a combat medic in active war zones, found a fragile, essential peace in the quiet predictability and sensory calm of her small, meticulously ordered, Japanese-inspired rock garden, its gently burbling water feature, a specific prescribed element of her ongoing therapy. These were not frivolous luxuries or aesthetic statements. They were fundamental, indispensable components of their hard-won, painstakingly reconstructed lives tools for survival and well-being. To Brenda Van Owen, however, judging by her increasingly hostile pronouncements and actions, they were apparently irritating eyesores, unwelcome visual reminders of a messy, imperfect world that intruded upon her pristine, tightly controlled domain, and perhaps subconscious symbols of a sacrifice she couldn't comprehend and therefore resented. The inciting incident, the first clear, unambiguous salvo in Brenda Van Owen's undeclared but increasingly vicious war on the veterans' fundamental right to live with dignity, comfort, and safety in their own adapted homes, had arrived with chilling formality 3 weeks prior. Each of the 5 disabled veterans residing on Sycamore Lane had received a stark, coldly worded, and officially sealed notice of bylaw violation and demand for immediate remediation from the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, signed with Brenda Van Owen's flamboyant, authoritative signature. The alleged violations enumerated within were as transparently petty and targeted as they were potentially devastatingly cruel. Sarge Peterson's sturdy, professionally installed ramp, a lifeline to the outside world, was cited for unapproved slope gradient and utilization of non-conforming construction materials, despite the fact that it had been certified as fully compliant with all federal ADA guidelines and local building codes at the time of its installation. Maria Sanchez's small, serene rock garden, with its miniature solar-powered waterfall that provided a constant, soothing soundscape, was summarily deemed an unauthorized major landscaping feature, potentially impacting established neighborhood drainage patterns and constituting a visual nuisance. Another long-term resident, old Lieutenant Davies, a frail widower who suffered from severe debilitating rheumatoid arthritis and used a series of discreetly placed but essential grab bars around his small front porch to maintain his precarious independence, was cited for affixing multiple unapproved external structural elements to the primary building facade, thereby compromising the architectural integrity of the community. The notices, almost identical in their threatening tone, demanded immediate and full remediation within a ludicrously short time frame of 14 days, corrective actions that would be not only financially ruinous, but in some cases physically impossible for the residents to undertake. They also threatened punitive, escalating daily fines for non-compliance starting at $100 per day. Ominously woven throughout the bureaucratic jargon were several pointed references to homeowner responsibility for maintaining proper surface water runoff grades and the sole and absolute liability of each individual property owner for preventing any and all instances of localized water pooling or soil saturation. It was, to any objective observer, a clear, undeniable campaign of highly targeted harassment, thinly and incompetently veiled in the language of community governance. The veterans had met at Antonio's house, dismayed and angry. "She can't do this," Maria had said, her voice tight. "These aren't decorations, they're how we live." Sarge had just shaken his head. "She's got the board in her pocket. This is just the beginning." The rising action, following those initial outrageous notices, had been a relentless, soul-crushing tide of escalating pressure and psychological warfare. Brenda Van Owen, wielding her newfound authority as HOA president like a medieval monarch, wields a scepter, had systematically and ruthlessly amplified her campaign against the Sycamore Lane veterans. She had successfully, and with suspicious speed, pushed through several new, vaguely worded, yet highly restrictive, aesthetic, environmental, and architectural covenants at a sparsely attended, hastily convened emergency HOA board meeting. A meeting for which many residents, including several of the veterans, claimed to have received inadequate or deliberately misleading notification. These new rules, drafted with an almost surgical precision, seemed almost exclusively designed to retroactively criminalize the unique, medically necessary adaptations of the veterans' homes. One new rule, for instance, prohibited any permanently installed or semi-permanent accessibility ramps constructed of wood composite materials or any non-pre-approved metallic alloys, effectively outlawing every existing ramp on Sycamore Lane. Another new covenant banned any freestanding or integrated water features, regardless of size or power source, without prior explicit written consent and a favorable hydrological impact study provided by the Architectural Review Committee, a committee which conveniently Brenda Van Owen herself now chaired and whose meetings were notoriously difficult to schedule. Armed with these new regulatory weapons, she had immediately begun issuing a fresh wave of violation notices, this time accompanied by exorbitant, crippling fines, often amounting to hundreds of dollars per day per alleged infraction. At the last contentious general HOA meeting, she had delivered a lengthy, condescending diatribe, ostensibly about the shared community responsibility of maintaining our prestigious Gold Star neighborhood status. But her speech was filled with thinly veiled, pointed criticisms about certain properties unfortunately failing to uphold the community's long-established high standards, and the urgent collective need to ensure that Willow Creek doesn't suffer a decline in desirability or property values due to a perceived lack of individual pride in external property appearances. Throughout this speech, her gaze had lingered with pointed, unmistakable meaning on Sarge Peterson and Maria Sanchez, who had bravely attended in a last desperate and ultimately futile attempt to reason with her and the other board members. They, along with Antonio Ramirez, speaking on behalf of the increasingly frail Lieutenant Davies, had tried to explain calmly and rationally the medical necessity and profound personal importance of their home modifications. They had offered to discuss potential compromises, to explore alternative materials or minor aesthetic adjustments if feasible and not detrimental to functionality. But Brenda Van Owen had dismissed their heartfelt pleas with an icy, patronizing politeness, stating with an air of unassailable authority that the bylaws, especially these new board-approved covenants, apply equally and unequivocally to all residents without exception or special consideration. A statement that rang with utter hollowness, given the transparently discriminatory and targeted nature of the new rules she had so skillfully engineered. The cumulative stress on the veterans was becoming unbearable, their homes once cherished sanctuaries of safety and independence, now transformed into sources of constant gnawing anxiety, potential financial ruin, and a deeply felt sense of persecution. Now, the raging spring storm, a furious tempest of driving wind and biblical quantities of rain, had become the dark, chaotic stage for what appeared to be the most shocking, most direct escalation of all in Brenda Van Owen's cruel campaign. As Dr. Elena Ramirez, her professional instincts already screaming alerts, rushed into her father's modest but impeccably kept house, shaking off the clinging cold of the relentless rain, Antonio met her at the door, his weathered face a mask of profound worry and simmering anger. "Elena Mija, thank God you're here. It's Sarge and Maria next door. Their places are flooding, Elena. Flooding badly. And it's not just the rain, it's like the water's coming up from the ground itself, right around their foundations. I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, seen every hurricane and tropical storm that's come through. I've never ever seen anything like this. Elena's mind, a finely tuned instrument for analyzing hydrological systems and diagnosing water-related disasters, immediately kicked into high gear, overriding her fatigue from the drive. Coming up from the ground, Dad. Not just runoff. That suggests a catastrophic drainage failure, a blockage, or something actively redirecting subsurface flow. She instinctively reached for her car keys, then remembered her heavy-duty waterproof flashlight and her emergency field kit, a satchel containing some basic diagnostic tools, waterproof notebooks, and sample bags she always kept in her vehicle out of professional habit. Let's go. Now. We need to see this. The scene that greeted them at Sarge Peterson's house, just 2 doors down on the slightly lower end of Sycamore Lane, was far worse than Elena had even imagined. Water, muddy, cold, and carrying a sickening smell of disturbed earth and decaying leaves, was already several inches deep across his entire living room floor, swirling with sinister intent around the base of his furniture, lapping at the electrical outlets. Sarge, his face a grim mask of frustration, anger, and dawning helplessness, was desperately trying to move cherished photographs, vital medical supplies, and important documents to higher shelves from his wheelchair, his powerful upper body straining his movements, agonizingly hampered by the rapidly rising tide that was now threatening to swamp the motors of his expensive custom-built chair. Elena, Antonio, it's like the damn earth just opened up and spewed all its water right into my house. Itim, he exclaimed, his voice strained, cracking, with an emotion that was more than just distress. It was the sound of a man watching his hard-won sanctuary being violated. My sump pump is running full tilt. I can hear it grinding, but it can't make a dent. It's never ever done this before, not even in Hurricane Agnes. Elena's trained analytical eyes immediately began scanning the room. The yard, the visible flow patterns of the invading water, her mind automatically processing a dozen variables. The rain was indeed torrential, a ferocious wind-driven deluge, but the way the water was so specifically, so intensely concentrating around Sarge's foundation and Maria's adjoining property, the sheer volume of water that seemed to be welling up from the saturated ground in their yards, while other nearby properties, even those slightly further down the natural slope, seemed relatively unaffected, was highly suspiciously anomalous. Sarge, she asked, her voice deliberately calm and authoritative, a practiced tone designed to cut through panic and elicit precise information. Where are your main roof downspouts located, and where do your primary yard drain access points connect to the storm sewer system? He pointed with a trembling hand towards the corners of his house and then towards the far edge of his inundated yard. All the downspouts are piped underground, supposed to go directly to the main storm sewer at the street. The main yard drain, the big one, is over there near the fence line I share with Maria's place. It's always handled everything before. Elena, seemingly impervious to the drenching rain and the swirling water now above her ankles, was already outside her powerful waterproof flashlight beam, cutting a swathe through the tumultuous darkness. Her father and a hastily summoned Tom Maxwell, another concerned neighbor from across the street, followed closely behind her, their faces etched with worried bewilderment. She quickly located the large grated yard drain inlet, the one designed to handle significant surface runoff from several properties. It was almost completely submerged, not, she noted with a surge of adrenaline, because it was overwhelmed by incoming water, but because it appeared to be critically blocked from below the water around it, unnaturally still, even seeming to back up from the grate itself. Then her flashlight beam moved to the area where Sarge's underground downspout pipes were supposed to connect to the main subterranean drainage line leading to the street. The ground there was visibly soft, recently disturbed, and a small, almost imperceptible, but undeniably artificial berm of freshly turned earth and strategically placed new-looking landscape timbers seemed to be effectively channeling the immense roof runoff directly towards Sarge's vulnerable foundation, rather than safely away from it. Her flashlight beam then caught something else, something that made her blood run cold, with dawning, sickening comprehension. The series of so-called decorative, rock-lined swales that Brenda Van Owen's hand-picked new HOA landscaping contractor had installed along the property lines of all the veterans' homes just 2 days before. Mrs. Van Owen had triumphantly announced these installations in a special HOA bulletin, citing them as necessary aesthetic improvements to neighborhood water flow management and visual harmony. These swales, far from aiding drainage as claimed, appeared to be functioning with terrifying efficiency as miniature dams trapping the massive storm runoff in the veterans' already low-lying yards, preventing its natural overland flow towards the street-side storm drains and creating localized reservoirs of standing water. It was a crude, almost laughably simple design if one knew what to look for, but in the context of this massive storm, it was proving to be terrifyingly destructively effective. This wasn't just coincidental negligence, Elena realized, with a sickening lurch in her stomach. The signs were mounting, pointing towards a deliberate, malicious, and horrifyingly calculated manipulation of the landscape and the critical drainage infrastructure. The midpoint twist, the chilling, undeniable, and professionally infuriating confirmation that this devastating targeted flooding was not a random act of God, nor a coincidental catastrophic system failure, but a calculated, premeditated act of sabotage, almost certainly orchestrated by Brenda Van Owen, began to crystallize with horrifying clarity, as Elena, soaked to the bone, but driven by a cold, focused fury, meticulously examined the compromised drainage systems around the affected homes in the storm's immediate murky and debris-strewn aftermath. With the torrential rain finally easing to a miserable, persistent drizzle as dawn approached, and using specialized hydrological probes, a trenching spade borrowed from her father's meticulously organized shed, and her own expert knowledge of fluid dynamics, she, along with a now equally grim-faced Antonio Ramirez and a visibly shaken Tom Maxwell, uncovered the damning, irrefutable evidence piece by piece. The primary yard drain shared by Sarge's and Maria's properties, the one designed to be the main relief for that entire section, hadn't just been casually clogged by storm debris, as one might initially suspect. It had been intentionally, systematically blocked from within the deep concrete catch basin by a heavy-duty industrial-grade plastic construction barrier, the kind used for silt fencing, which had been expertly and forcefully wedged deep into the main outflow pipe, effectively sealing it completely shut. This was no accident. It required tools and deliberate effort. Furthermore, the newly installed aesthetic landscape timbers and rock swales, the ones lauded by the HOA's contractor, were found to be positioned with an almost malevolent hydrological precision, not to improve or beautify drainage as claimed in Mrs. Van Owen's glossy community newsletter, but to create a series of interconnected artificial reservoirs, effectively concentrating the massive storm runoff from the entire upper part of the street directly onto the veterans' slightly lower-lying properties, while subtly, almost invisibly, diverting it away from other, presumably more compliant homes further up the gentle incline. Then, as if on cue from a badly written melodrama, a shaken and guilt-ridden Mr. Arthur Henderson, the HOA's recently retired elderly and now deeply distressed part-time groundskeeper, approached them, his worn face pale, his hands trembling. "Dr. Ramirez. Mr. Ramirez." He began, his voice barely a whisper, thick with a mixture of fear and shame. I need to tell you something. Something I should have said before. Mrs. Van Owen. She had that new landscaping crew, the ones from Prestige Property Enhancements, out here all day Tuesday. I saw her with them myself, for hours, pointing at these specific drains at the grading, around Mr. Peterson's and Ms. Sanchez's and Lieutenant Davies's yards. She told them I heard her quite clearly. She said, "Ensure all excess surface water flows exactly where it's supposed to, according to my revised comprehensive landscaping plan. We need to address these persistent non-compliance issues decisively and permanently." Then just yesterday morning, before this storm was due to hit, she gave me a direct verbal order not to clear any debris or check the functionality of these specific drains here on Sycamore Lane, said it was part of the new integrated water management strategy being implemented by the professionals. I didn't understand then. I thought it was just more of her bossiness. But now... He trailed off, his face ashen with dawning comprehension and self-reproach, his gaze fixed on the devastation around them. Elena, her mind racing, also discovered through a quick search of publicly available county records on her phone that the emergency overflow culvert, situated at the far end of Sycamore Lane, a critical piece of stormwater infrastructure specifically designed to channel extreme stormwater overflows away from the residential area and into a designated natural retention pond bordering the adjacent undeveloped woodland, showed clear, undeniable signs of recent significant and deliberate obstruction. Heavy rocks, construction debris, and compacted earth, far too substantial and strategically placed to be the result of natural storm accumulation, had been piled high at its primary inlet, significantly reducing its designed discharge capacity by at least 70%. And the final damning piece of documentation, the work order for the urgent landscaping and drainage enhancements on Sycamore Lane lots 12 to 16, which Elena later obtained through a discreet but official inquiry via her contacts at the county planning department, was signed with Brenda Van Owen's flourishing authoritative signature. Typed neatly beneath the main scope of work was a handwritten initialed addendum: all work to be completed no later than end of day, April 25th. Primary focus on rectifying persistent drainage irregularities and aesthetic nonconformities in designated lots 12 through 16, which corresponded exactly to the veterans' properties. No deviation from HOA-approved revised topographical plan, BVO. The date, April 25th, was just 2 days before the major storm system had been forecast with near 90% certainty by the National Weather Service to impact their region. It was a meticulously planned, wickedly executed, and cowardly act of hydro-sabotage. The malicious intent was now starkly, sickeningly clear to cause maximum devastating damage to the veterans' homes, to potentially render their specially adapted, unaesthetic properties uninhabitable, to punish them for their perceived defiance and their very existence, all under the conveniently chaotic and legally ambiguous cover of a major natural disaster. The climax of this unfolding waterlogged nightmare arrived not in a hushed courtroom, at least not initially, but during a tense, emotionally charged emergency community meeting. It had been hastily convened in the undamaged, brightly lit Willow Creek Estates clubhouse, 2 days after the storm had finally abated, leaving a trail of muck misery and simmering resentment in its wake. The clubhouse itself, situated on slightly higher ground at the development's entrance, had remained completely untouched by the flooding, a stark, silent testament to the selective nature of the devastation that only amplified the bitterness and anger of those whose homes and lives had been so cruelly thrown into chaos. The large meeting room was packed to capacity standing room only along the walls, the air thick and heavy, with a volatile, almost combustible mixture of residual fear, palpable anger, rampant suspicion, and the cloying, unmistakable scent of damp clothing, lingering mildew, and collective anxiety. Brenda Van Owen, presiding over the assembly with an air of carefully cultivated, almost theatrical grave concern and solemnity, opened the meeting by expressing her most profound and heartfelt sympathies for all those residents affected by the unprecedented, unforeseen, and truly tragic flooding event that has befallen our usually peaceful community. She spoke with practiced eloquence of the unpredictable and often cruel fury of Mother Nature, and then with a subtle but unmistakable shift in tone, began to hint darkly at possible pre-existing deferred maintenance issues on certain individual properties that might have, unfortunately and unintentionally, exacerbated the localized impact of this extreme weather phenomenon. Her carefully chosen implications, though couched in layers of feigned sympathetic understanding, were chillingly clear to those who had been targeted. The veterans themselves, she was suggesting, were somehow to blame for their own catastrophic misfortune, due to their own alleged negligence. Sarge Peterson, his face etched with exhaustion and a righteous, slow-burning fury, his voice raw with emotion but remarkably steady with indignation, was the first to publicly challenge her disingenuous narrative. Mrs. Van Owen, he began his words amplified slightly by a small portable microphone someone had thrust into his hand, cutting sharply through her silken platitudes. This wasn't just Mother Nature playing favorites. My home, Maria Sanchez's home next door, Lieutenant Davies's home down the street. We weren't just unlucky, Mrs. Van Owen. We were targeted. Our drainage systems, the ones your HOA contractors just improved, were deliberately systematically compromised. And we have proof. A low, shocked murmur rippled through the crowded room. Brenda Van Owen's perfectly made-up face tightened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something cold and calculating in her eyes, before her mask of concerned empathy snapped back into place. Sergeant Peterson, she cooed, her voice dripping with false solicitude, While I deeply understand and share your profound distress, and indeed the distress of all affected residents, I must gently but firmly caution you against making such unfounded, baseless, and frankly inflammatory accusations. The Homeowners Association is already in the process of commissioning a fully independent third-party engineering report to ascertain the precise causes of this unfortunate incident. It was at that precise moment that Dr. Elena Ramirez, who had been sitting quietly and unobtrusively beside her father in the second row, rose slowly and deliberately to her feet. "Mrs. Van Owen," she stated, her voice clear, calm, and carrying an unexpected, undeniable weight of inherent authority that commanded instant, complete silence throughout the suddenly hushed room. "Perhaps I can shed some immediate professional scientific light on this very distressing situation. For those of you who may not know me, I am Dr. Elena Ramirez. I am the current State Director for Water Resources and Environmental Management." A collective, audible gasp swept through the room. Many residents knew her vaguely, as Antonio Ramirez's quiet, intelligent daughter, the one with the important-sounding but unspecified government job, who visited her father occasionally. Few, if any, were aware of the true scope and power of her official capacity. Brenda Van Owen's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, her carefully maintained composure visibly faltering, a flush rising on her neck. "For the past 48 hours, Elena continued, her gaze steady and direct, "my office, in conjunction with certified local engineers and hydrologists, has been conducting a thorough, intensive hydrological and forensic engineering assessment of the localized flooding event that occurred specifically on Sycamore Lane. My preliminary findings, Mrs. Van Owen, are conclusive, deeply disturbing, and frankly indicative of criminal intent." Using a projector and a laptop she had brought connected to the clubhouse's AV system, Elena then proceeded to lay out with calm, irrefutable scientific precision the overwhelming evidence of deliberate targeted sabotage. She showed high-resolution aerial photographs taken by a commercial drone service before and immediately after the HOA's landscaping enhancements, clearly highlighting the subtle but critical alterations to the existing surface grading around the veterans' properties. She displayed stark close-up images of the intentionally blocked yard drains, the heavy plastic barrier wedged deep within the outflow pipe, the strategically placed earthen berms designed to channel water, the recently disturbed soil around the downspout connections, and the obstructed emergency overflow culvert at the end of the lane. She presented detailed rainfall intensity data from the storm, precise inflow and outflow calculations for the affected catchment area, and sophisticated hydrological computer models demonstrating unequivocally and graphically that the specific concentrated flooding experienced by the veterans' homes was not and could not have been a natural hydrological occurrence, given the original engineered design of the community's stormwater system. It was, she stated with firm conviction, her voice resonating through the stunned silence, a direct, inevitable result of intentional, malicious, and professionally executed modifications to critical drainage infrastructure, modifications specifically and demonstrably designed to inundate those particular properties while sparing others. She then presented a copy of the HOA-approved work order for the landscaping with Brenda Van Owen's clear signature and damning handwritten addendum, and a notarized summary of Mr. Henderson's witness statement regarding Van Owen's explicit instructions to the landscaping crew and her direct order to him not to clear any debris from those specific drains immediately prior to the well-forecasted major storm event. The cumulative effect of the evidence was crushing, undeniable. The room erupted. Shouts of outraged disbelief and raw anger rained down upon Brenda Van Owen, whose face had gone from a controlled pale to a ghastly mottled white. She attempted to interrupt, to bluster, to deny, to deflect, her voice rising in pitch, but her words were drowned out by the rising tide of community fury. Maria Sanchez, her voice amplified by the small microphone Tom Maxwell had managed to pass to her, then spoke her words, trembling with suppressed trauma, but infused with a powerful, righteous anger. She described the sheer terror of the rising water in the dark, the frantic effort to save her service dog, the irreplaceable loss of personal mementos, the desecration of her home, the profound threat to her fragile, hard-won sense of security. "You did this to us, Mrs. Van Owen," she cried, her voice breaking, but her gaze locked on the crumbling HOA president. "You deliberately flooded our homes, our only sanctuaries, because you don't like our ramps, because our lives, our sacrifices don't fit into your perfect, sterile little picture of Willow Creek. As the emotional chaos in the room reached its deafening peak, and just as Brenda Van Owen seemed about to attempt a desperate flight from the podium, two uniformed county sheriff's deputies and a stern-faced senior investigator from the State Environmental Protection Agency's Criminal Investigation Division, all of whom Elena had discreetly alerted earlier that day, providing them with a comprehensive evidence package, stepped quietly but purposefully into the clubhouse through a side entrance. The lead deputy, a tall, imposing figure, moved calmly through the parting crowd and approached the now visibly trembling Brenda Van Owen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice polite but utterly firm, his hand resting near his holstered sidearm. "Brenda Van Owen, we have a judicially approved warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with multiple felony counts, including willful and malicious destruction of private property, multiple counts of aggravated reckless endangerment, insurance fraud, and the deliberate violation of state environmental protection statutes regarding the tampering of critical water management infrastructure. You'll need to come with us now." The falling action was as swift as it was unsparing, a necessary and cleansing deluge of justice, following the literal deluge of malice. Brenda Van Owen's arrest, the sight of her being led away in handcuffs from the chaotic community meeting, sent profound shockwaves not only through the stunned residents of Willow Creek Estates, but far beyond the story, quickly and voraciously picked up by regional and even national news outlets, often under headlines like HOA president accused of intentionally flooding disabled veterans' homes in aesthetic vendetta. She was summarily and ignominiously removed from her HOA presidency in disgrace by an emergency vote of the remaining horrified board members, facing a daunting barrage of serious criminal charges, and almost immediately a slew of civil lawsuits filed by the emotionally and financially devastated veterans. Her carefully constructed, obsessively controlled world of aesthetic tyranny and petty power plays collapsed with stunning finality into a hopeless mire of crippling legal fees, widespread public condemnation, and the stark, unpalatable reality of a potential lengthy prison sentence. Her husband, a hitherto silent partner in her social climbing, quietly filed for divorce a month later. In the immediate aftermath of the storm and Van Owen's arrest, the Willow Creek community shocked into a collective awareness and deeply shamed by what had been allowed to fester and then erupt under their very noses, rallied around the affected veterans with an outpouring of genuine support and practical assistance that was both humbling and inspiring to witness. Volunteers organized by a reinvigorated Antonio Ramirez and a determined Tom Maxwell armed themselves with mops, industrial fans, heavy-duty dehumidifiers, and mountains of donated building supplies. They worked tirelessly day and night alongside professional disaster remediation crews to gut dry out and begin the arduous process of rebuilding the flooded homes. Local contractors, many of them veterans themselves, offered their skilled services at deeply discounted rates or entirely pro bono. A community emergency fund established with an initial anonymous donation from Elena Ramirez herself quickly raised tens of thousands of dollars to help cover uninsured losses, replace destroyed adaptive equipment, and fund necessary upgrades to make the veterans' homes even more resilient against future threats, whether natural or man-made. The veterans, though, undeniably and profoundly shaken by the betrayal and the violation, displayed incredible fortitude and resilience, their spirits visibly buoyed by the unexpected overwhelming wave of genuine compassion, solidarity, and tangible help from their neighbors, many of whom confessed their shame at having previously ignored or dismissed Van Owen's earlier, less overt acts of harassment. Dr. Elena Ramirez, true to her professional calling and her personal sense of justice, leveraged the undeniable, egregious evidence from the Willow Creek case and the ensuing public and media outrage to spearhead a significant, much-needed legislative initiative at the state level. She worked tirelessly with a bipartisan coalition of state lawmakers, influential veterans advocacy groups, who now saw this as a critical issue of housing security for their constituents and national disability rights organizations to draft, champion, and ultimately secure the passage of the Safe Homes, Secure Drainage, and HOA Accountability Act. This landmark piece of legislation established for the very first time in their state's history stringent legally enforceable state oversight over HOA-controlled critical infrastructure, particularly stormwater management drainage systems and flood mitigation measures. It mandated regular independent certified inspections of such systems, required transparent publicly accessible maintenance protocols and records, and instituted robust legal protections for homeowners against arbitrary, discriminatory, or dangerously negligent modifications to community infrastructure by HOA boards. It also created clear, accessible legal avenues for residents to challenge an HOA's mismanagement or deliberate misuse of such infrastructure, and imposed severe civil and criminal penalties for deliberate tampering, gross negligence, or actions that knowingly endangered homes' lives or the environment. The Willow Creek incident, with all its sordid details, became a pivotal, widely cited case study in legislative hearings and public debates, forever changing the landscape of HOA power and accountability in the state, and prompting similar reviews in neighboring jurisdictions. In the final restorative resolution, the community of Willow Creek Estates underwent a profound and lasting transformation. The toxic reign of aesthetic obsession and petty tyranny was definitively replaced by a new, deeply embedded ethos of inclusivity, genuine empathy, transparent governance, and shared community responsibility. A new interim HOA board was quickly elected, composed of residents like Tom Maxwell and eventually Sarge Peterson himself, individuals who prioritized the safety, well-being, and fair treatment of all residents far above superficial appearances or arbitrary property value metrics. They worked closely and cooperatively with Elena Ramirez's office and independent hydrological engineers to completely redesign, rebuild, and significantly upgrade the community's entire drainage and stormwater management systems, incorporating cutting-edge environmentally sound principles and ensuring that such a malicious, targeted act of sabotage could never ever happen again. The veterans' homes were fully restored, made safer, more accessible, and more flood-resistant than before, their small therapeutic gardens replanted and flourishing, their ramps and other adaptive features now viewed not as blemishes or signs of nonconformity, but as proud symbols of resilient sacrifice and the community's renewed, unwavering commitment to supporting and honoring its most vulnerable members. Sarge Peterson, initially reluctant, was eventually persuaded to run for and was overwhelmingly elected to the new permanent HOA board, his pragmatic, no-nonsense voice, now a respected and influential force for positive, equitable change within his own neighborhood. The positive, impactful ending of this harrowing saga left an indelible mark on all involved and on the broader society. Brenda Van Owen was convicted on multiple felony charges, and in addition to a significant prison sentence, was ordered by the court to pay substantial financial restitution to each of the veterans she had harmed, her assets seized to cover the costs. The Safe Homes, Secure Drainage, and HOA Accountability Act became a model for similar legislation in other states, leading to improved protections and greater accountability for homeowners nationwide. Dr. Elena Ramirez, though, she consistently sought no personal glory and always redirected any praise towards the resilience of the veterans and the hard work of her team, found immense professional and profound personal satisfaction in seeing justice comprehensively served. She knew that her intervention, born from a daughter's concern and a professional's outrage, had not only saved her father's friends and their homes, but had also catalyzed lasting systemic change that would make countless other communities safer and more just. Willow Creek Estates. Once a place of hidden hostility, simmering resentments, and rigidly enforced conformity, blossomed into a genuinely supportive, diverse, and proudly united neighborhood. The once feared weaponized waters were now properly managed, respected, and understood, a symbol of a community that had courageously weathered a terrible storm of human malice and had emerged scarred but undeniably stronger, wiser, more vigilant, and infinitely more compassionate on the other side. The gentle, undisturbed murmur of Maria Sanchez's fully restored and now beloved garden, water feature no longer a point of contention, but a cherished melodic sound of enduring peace and healing, served as a quiet, constant reminder of the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit and the ultimate, inexorable triumph of justice over a devastating flood of deceit.